This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, anyone, any questions, guys, before I get started? Anyone, any questions that I can take before I get started? So, as you all know, we are coming just back to the theory right now on virtual networks and all these things that we are looking at. So, any questions there? Anyone, any questions that I can take till there? Okay, so let's get started. So, let's see. So, as I was telling on the last class when we were looking at the virtual network concepts, I was saying that virtual network is nothing but it's like a space, or we call it as in CIDR address space. And this is going to give you some kind of a network isolation. When I say network isolation, this is your own space on the cloud. So Azure is a public cloud. This is now your own space on the public cloud out here. And inside which Azure is now expecting you to go ahead and create, or Azure is now expecting you to go ahead and, let's say, divide this particular space into smaller subsectors so that you can start using it. And these subsectors of spaces are called as subnets. So you can have multiple subnets, saying subnet 1, subnet 2, 3, 4, however big your space is, those many subnets that you can get. And you can divide them in a very judicial way. And we'll also talk about why you need to divide them and all these things out here as such. But this is what we are looking at, is that in an address space, which is starting with something like 10.0.0.0, the maximum subnets that you can get, or the maximum address range that you can get, is /8 because of RFC 1918 standards, which governs the usage of something like private address space. So you cannot do a /7 or a 6 or a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You cannot do that. And lesser the subnet masking, meaning lesser this number, greater is your addresses. Because as we see the calculation, right, it is 2 to the power of 32 minus whatever is the subnet masking. So as and when the subnet masking is less, the 2 power, let's say something, grows up, and the number of spaces that you get increases. And as we've also seen that if you create multiple subnets, no two subnets can have the same name. No two subnets will take the same name, will have the same name out here. And no two subnets can have overlapping address spaces, which means I cannot do something like 10.0.0.0 /24 for subnet 1 and cannot be reusing the same thing called 10.0.0.0 for subnet 2 out here as such. So we cannot have overlapping address spaces out here as such while coming to subnets. So let's create a simple VNet. So let me come here and let me put a subnet here. And I'll say that I will just start with just one subnet today. So let me do that. So let me say virtual networks. Let me say create a virtual network today. And while I'm creating a virtual network today, I do not have a resource group. So I'll say this network RG, and I'll say okay. So I would just go ahead and, let's say, create something called as a network RG out here. And then the name of the virtual network, I'll say it is a sample VNet. I'll say this is East US2. I'll say security, I'll say IP addresses, and it's giving me a default IP address, which is 10.0.0.0/16, and a default subnet called 10.0.0.0/24. I'm good with this. I'll take the default values. I'll say review and create. So it's running some final validations out here, and it will go ahead and create me a virtual network and a subnet address space inside that particular virtual network out here. So let me go ahead and do that. Let me create this out. So this is what it's going to go ahead and create, or this is what it's going to go ahead and create for me out here as such. Now, as and when I do that, as and when I create this particular, let's say, virtual network and the subnet inside the virtual network, I would like to go ahead and create a storage account within the bounds of the virtual network out here. When I say this, what I'm trying to do is that I am trying to protect my storage account from the internet traffic. I'm trying to protect my storage account from the internet. So which means that you as a user coming from the internet cannot directly talk to my storage account because you have a virtual network protecting the same. So all your requests are bounced back. So no matter what you do, you cannot go ahead and, let's say, talk to this particular storage account unless the IP address where you're working from is actually whitelisted on this particular storage account out here as such. So for which I would, need to create a storage account, of course, and I would, let's say, need to go ahead and attach this particular storage account with that particular virtual network out here. So let's go ahead and also do that, and let's see what do we get out of this. So now let's understand what are the resources that we do have. Firstly, I have a virtual network with an address space of 10.0.0.0/16, which is inside this particular resource group called network, the network RG. This is something that I created. And if I just scroll down, I have something called address spaces, where it's telling this is the address space of the virtual network with about 65,536 of address count. And then I have something called as a subnet out here with somewhere around 251 available IP addresses. Again, though each and every subnet gives you 256 IP addresses, there is something called address reservation by the cloud provider. So it is 256 minus 5, which is equal to 251 addresses is what you get. So 251 addresses is what you get whenever you go ahead and create a subnet out here as such. So having that said, let's come here and let's say that, okay, when the subnet is created, you have 251 IP addresses within that, which means that you can secure 251 such resources inside one subnet. It's that big. You can take 251 storage accounts and throw it inside this particular subnet, and this subnet will start protecting those particular storage accounts out here from the internet traffic out here as such. So this is what I have. So now what I'll do is, since I have the virtual network and the subnet inside that particular virtual network, I will start creating my storage account service. So let me do that. Let me go ahead and say storage account. Let me create a storage account, and I'll say create new resource group. I'll say store sorry, I'll say storage RG, storage hyphen RG, whatever it is. I'll just scroll down and I'll give a name to this particular storage account, telling it as demo storage vnet abcxyz, some random name, and very importantly, the location of the resource, which is the storage account, and the location of the network. It has to be in the same region. Here it is East US. I'll change it to East US 2. It has to be in the same region so that the network can actually support the protection or the integration of the storage account out here. If it's in a different region, you cannot attach it. You cannot attach a network and the storage account service out here as such. So what I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and say this is ECUS2. I'm taking this as ECUS2 out here, and I'll just scroll down, and I'm telling that the performance is standard, and I'm telling that the redundancy is something like LRS, locally redundant storage. And apart from that, I'm not doing anything. I'll just go ahead and, let's say, review and create this out. So I'm not going to advance, I'm not going to anything. Optionally, if you want to integrate your storage account directly with a network while creating it, you can go into the networking tab here and say enable public access only from, let's say, something like networks and public IP addresses and so on and so forth. This is something that you can optionally do, but what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and say review and create this out. And after creation of the storage account, I would like to attach this particular storage account, or I would like to, let's say, go ahead and connect this particular storage account with my virtual network. So let me come here, and this is what I'm doing right now. I'm going in and creating this particular storage account, and once the storage account is created, let's create a container. Let's deploy some data into that particular container, and then see how we can access this particular storage account outside the virtual network, and what happens to the access when we get the storage account inside the virtual network. And while we are getting the storage account inside the virtual network, there is a very important concept called service endpoints. We'll talk about what exactly do we mean by something called as by something called as service endpoints out here, and we'll understand how exactly is the concept that comes through it, and so on and so forth. Is any questions still here, guys? Anyone any questions still here that I can take? Anyone any questions that I can take till here? Okay, so let me go back, and I have a storage account service that is already created for me. So let me go into something called as a storage RG into the storage account. And right now I'll just go ahead and into the containers. Let me go and create a new container out here. I'll say container one. I'll say create. And as when I create this, I can go ahead and upload some data into this particular container. So I'll say upload, and let's go into some random folder of my PC. And yesterday we were looking at all those scripts and all, right? So let's go ahead and upload all those scripts. Let me say Control A and say upload open, and say upload this out. So all I'm doing is that I'm just taking all my PowerShell scripts that I have, and I'm just taking all those scripts and I'm throwing it inside the container of the storage account. It's unstructured data, can still protect it. It's nothing but a file. So you can place all these files, all the, let's say, file out here inside this particular container, all the files inside the container in the form of a blob. Again, this is setting in something like hot. This is setting in, let's say, in this particular tier. Now, if I were to go ahead and generate a shared access token for this particular container and give it to you, you can simply use a Microsoft Storage Explorer, connect to this particular container and grab all my data. Or if you have the access keys to this particular, let's say, storage account, you can simply go ahead, take those access keys out there and establish a connection with my storage account service, grab all the data out here as such. Or if you are a part of, let's say, the identity and access management, which means that you have a direct role on top of this particular storage account, you can still go ahead and let's say establish a connection with my storage containers and so on and so forth. This is something that you could do if the storage account service is sitting here in the internet, which means that I can freely, or anyone from the internet can freely go ahead and talk to this particular storage account out here. You can directly establish a connection with this particular storage account. All you need is either the access keys or the shared access signature, or you have to be a part of the Azure Active Directory out here as such. This is what you could do, or this is what you can do out here if you are a part of, let's say, that particular storage account service. But I don't want my sensitive data, or I don't want all this crucial data to be sitting out there in the internet. So what I'll intend to do is I will go ahead and try to get this particular storage account service inside the virtual network. In order to do that, I will go into something known as networking, security plus networking. I'll say networking. And once we go inside the networking, it's now, or the storage account is now telling that, okay, fine, enable access from all the networks. It's telling, okay, fine, you know what, you can go ahead and literally have a, let's say, communication to this particular storage service to any network in the world, which means that even if you're from the internet, I will allow you. But I'll say, okay, fine, you know what, I don't want it to be like that. I want it to, or I want my storage account to be only accessible over selected networks and IP addresses. And the selection is going to be my selection, meaning which network or which IP address you need to communicate with is something that I would need to select. So I'll just scroll down, and here I have an option to go ahead and add my own IP address. This is my own IP address out here that today from where I'm working. This is my own IP address. If I just scroll up, there's something called add existing virtual network. So I'll say, you know what, add an existing virtual network. And in here, there is something called as a sample network out here, or a sample VNet out here that we have created. And it's telling, okay, fine, you know what, under which subnet of this particular virtual network should I get, let's say, or should I get attached to? Very importantly, when you create a storage account and try to attach to the virtual network, it is not attached directly to the virtual network, but it is attached to the subnet of the virtual network. This is something that we have to, let's say, remember, is that I am not attaching a service, or I am not attaching a service like, let's say, for example, storage account. I am not attaching it directly to the virtual network. Rather, I am attaching it to the subnet of the virtual network right now. And that's the reason it's asking me, okay, fine, what is the subnet? I only have one subnet. And here, if you see, there is something called as default subnet. And there is something called as service endpoint required. This is something that I need to focus on in today's session, on what do I really mean by service endpoints, and why are they really important, or why are they rather really mandatory. Service endpoints. So let me do one thing. Let me first say select this particular default subnet, and I'll say enable the service endpoint. It's saying, okay, fine, the following networks do not have a service endpoint enabled. Let me enable it, and after that I can go ahead and add it. So there are two steps that I took. Firstly, it's the service endpoint that I enabled. Finally, I said add, and then I'm finally saying save. So now what I did is I enabled something called as service endpoints. And after I enable the service endpoint, I went ahead and I'm creating a connection between my storage account and the virtual network so that the storage account can be protected. And now if you see, it is saved right now. It's saying this is saved and all that stuff. And now if I go into the containers and try to, let's say, grab some data from the internet traffic, this is the error that I'm going to get, telling that the request is not authorized to perform. Again, in order to bypass this error, I will have to still come down to the networking, and from the networking I'll have to say, okay, fine, add the client IP range. I'll say save, meaning I'm whitelisting my own IP address out here. This is called IP whitelisting right now, which means that all the IP addresses that you provide here are going to be allowed to establish a communication with your storage container out here as such. So I'm coming inside the container. Now I'm able to see the data. If my IP address is not present, I won't be able to see the data out here as such. Yes, any questions still here? This was just the revision, or this was just a recap of what we were doing in the earlier class. So any questions still here that I can take? Any questions that I can take till here? Okay, so let me go back and let me see. Now, if I go into my resource groups, I have something called network RG, or storage RG, and then there's something called network watcher RG. We'll talk about what really network watcher RGs are. But let me go into the network RG. This is something that I created. And inside this network RG, I have something called as a sample virtual network. I'll go here, and inside which I'll go into the subnets. I have one subnet. I'll just click on the subnet. And if I click on the subnet, if I just scroll down, there is something called service endpoints. And as of now, there is a service endpoint called Microsoft.storage which is enabled. Now, I would say learn more. I'll just click on this button called learn more to understand what these service endpoints really are. I'll just go here, and this is what it's telling me. A virtual network service endpoint. It's telling virtual network service endpoints provides a secure and a direct connectivity to Azure services over an optimized route over the Azure backbone network. Endpoints allow you to secure your critical resources to only your virtual network and so on and so forth. What do you mean by this? Let's see. This is the terminology that I am really focused on, which is called virtual network service endpoint provides a secure and direct access connectivity to Azure services over the optimized network over the Azure backbone network out here as such. Now, what do you really mean by this is this. See, whenever, let's imagine this, okay, whenever you go ahead and let's say want to communicate with your storage account, which is even sitting inside the virtual network, see, one thing that you need to use is an internet. Your laptop needs to have an internet connection, and using that particular internet, you talk to any other services or any, let's say, anything. As a matter of fact, you talk to, let's say, any other service or anyone, or any email, or if I'm getting, let's say, a video call or normal a voice call over the internet, what I'm doing is that I am sending some information from my machine to the internet, and from the internet to this particular service. And this information that you send from your laptop, right? We call this as data packets. Simple. You're taking some information, you're packing that particular information and sending it in the form of packets out here in order into the internet, and from the internet, that request, that data packet, right? It's going to your services. And this device can be your, let's say, mobile, it can be your laptop, it can be anything out here as such. And the receiver can be anyone. For example, I have a printer in my house, and I want to use my, let's say, laptop in order to go ahead and give a wireless printing option, right? So what I can do is that the first thing, I have to configure my printer in such a way that printer and my, let's say, the laptop are, let's say, over the same router. There is a device called router, and over that router I am able to, let's say, go ahead and talk to my printer, go ahead and give it instructions telling that, okay, fine, please print this particular page, or please do this particular operation, and so on and so forth. So this connection is important over the internet out here. So I'm just sending some informations in the form of data packets that's being received by the printer, and the printer is talking to me, and so on and so forth. My mobile is talking to the printer. So there's a lot of data exchange that is going around. Also, just see, when you are using the internet, and let's say you are using some kind of a service like email. So you have a friend that is sitting in another part of the world. You just want to send him an email. So what you do is that simply go to Gmail, use the internet, and send your information. When you type the email, it's nothing but some amount of data. Each and every email is some KBs of data out here. So you're taking the data and throwing it over the internet, so that this email goes through the internet and goes through the receiver's end. The same thing happens with your, let's say, voice over calls over the internet, and so on and so forth. So your WhatsApp calls and all these things, they are nothing but pieces of information that are traveling over the internet, and so on and so forth. So what I'm doing is that, using my internet, if you see, I am able to, let's say, send data packets. I'm using the same data packets for emails. I'm talking to Azure over the same internet. I'm talking to printer over the same internet. I'm doing a lot of things over the same internet out here as such, which means that there is a lot of data that is that is going outside, let's say, from my laptop. But the issue with this particular data is that, see, I am using a public internet. I'm using a public internet to go ahead and, let's say, send my emails, or I'm using a public internet to go ahead and talk to my printer. I'm using the same public internet to go ahead and talk to the Azure resources that I do have. Now, what Azure is telling, that, what, it's good, it's okay if you use a public internet, but see, what will happen is that public internet is something that I cannot control. Microsoft is telling, what, public internet is a service which I have no control on, which means the data that you send and receive over a public internet can be hacked. This can be hacked into. Someone from the outside world can just come inside this particular internet, let's say, connection, and they can just grab all your data. And again, guys, internet is nothing but a set of wires. They are a set of cables that are laid down by someone, and we are just using those cables in order to transfer all this data. And Microsoft is telling, okay, fine, what, I am okay, I have no control if you're using the internet to talk to your printer or to your email, but I am not going to allow you, if your resources are protected inside a virtual network, I am not going to allow you to go ahead and talk to the same resource over the same internet connection that you're using for emails and that you're using for your printer, and so on and so forth. I cannot let you use the public internet route. Rather, please use, do not use this, please use something called as an intranet. There is a difference between internet and intranet out here as such.
Internet is publicly available, it's global. Intranet, now Azure is telling, is only for my customers, is only for my tenants, or only for my clients out here. So Azure is telling that, you know what, just like the internet, I have multiple data centers across the world, right? Azure has about 63, 64 data centers today that are running across the world, and each and every data center is connected to each other, meaning each and every data center has its own connection to each other. Azure has established a connection with each and every data center using its own cables. So if you look at the infrastructure map that Azure really provides you, so that's a very critical, let's say, uh, subject that I'm getting into. So I'll say Azure infrastructure map. So it's telling Azure global infrastructure experience, and let's go here and let me allow this to get loaded. And what it does give you is that it just gives you a world map, or it just gives you the globe out here, and it tells you where all Azure data centers are actually established. I'll say skip introduction, and I'll say explore the globe, and this is what it's telling me. So it's just telling me that, you know what, these are the blue dots that you see, all the blue dots and all these dots that you see are nothing but my data centers, meaning Azure's data center out here. And these data centers are established across the world, across continents, across the world. And you also have India here, where it's saying, okay, fine, these are all the data centers that are present. And you can interact with them. You can just click on the data center. So you can just interact with them. You can just click on the data center, say South India. It's telling where the data center is located, and where exactly it is, and so on and so forth. It's telling location Chennai, and so on and so forth. It's telling where my data center is really there, and all these things out. And very importantly, it's also telling that, you know what, each and every data center that you do have is connected to other data centers using some cables out here. So let me go ahead and stop this out real quick. It's telling each and every data center that you see has its own cables, meaning there are a lot of cables that are attached, and all these cables are for communication between the data centers. So you have a data center that is sitting in East US, which is somewhere here, and you have another data center sitting in, let's say, the West Europe, which is somewhere here. And it's saying, you know what, both the data centers are actually communicating with each other over this cable that you see on the sea, over this cable that you see, which is going underwater. So there's an underwater cable that is laid down, and all the communication between these two data centers, all the data packets that are being transferred between these two data centers are happening over, let's say, this particular cable. Microsoft is now telling me that, okay, fine, since I have already laid down all these cables, right? When you talk to my service, don't use the internet, but rather use this particular intranet service, which is called now as an Azure backbone. Meaning, don't go with the internet cables, go with rather the intranet cables, so that now I have a control of the security. I, as in Microsoft, has a control over the security. And this is not the same cable that you use to go ahead and send your email or talk to your, let's say, printer, and so on and so forth. This is something that you don't do. So Microsoft is telling, okay, fine, you know what, since I've already established cables, please use, whenever you go ahead and, let's say, communicate with the service, please use these cables in order to go ahead and talk to that particular service, and make sure that all the data exchange happens over these particular cables to the Azure services out here, like a storage account service. And how do I tell Microsoft to use this particular cable, or how do I tell Microsoft to use this particular route, is by declaring something called as a service endpoint. I'm telling that, you know what, whenever I'm talking to a service called Microsoft Storage, make sure, now if you see this is Microsoft Storage, you have multiple services like SQL, Service Bus, Key Vaults, and all these things out that supports the, let's say, service endpoints. And if I save this out, still okay, fine, you know what, I will give you something called as a service endpoint called Microsoft.storage. And now it's telling, okay, fine, you know what, whenever you talk to this particular service called Microsoft, let's say, storage out here, your connections are going to go over the Azure backbone, meaning the infrastructure that we're talking about is, it's going to go over the Azure backbone, and then your connection is going to come, or then your request is going to come into that particular storage service out here as such. And this is how, on the whole, it's going to happen. So okay, fine. You know what? This is your laptop, and you basically send your data packets over the internet, and from there, it's going to come into your storage service out here as such. This is the whole and soul mechanism in which a service endpoint works. So as and when you do a service endpoint, you are no longer using the internet, but you're using a set of cables that are, or a bunch of cables that are actually laid down by Microsoft out here as such. Yes. Any questions, guys? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till you? Anyone? Any questions? Anyone? Any questions? Anything that you're following? Anything that you're not following, guys? Guys, am I audible? Any questions that I can take? Yes, no, maybe.
All good, sir.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything that you want to discuss? Anything that we want to discuss here, guys? So the reason that I'm taking this concept today is because there is a very low strength. I agree that after a festival, there's a very low strength today. So I wanted to cover these service endpoints because this was a concept that got missed. That we were doing earlier, and from let's say the next session, we will be again going ahead and coming back to let's say Azure DevOps out here. Because last session that we did was Azure DevOps, and I just want to come down or just want to fall back into Azure DevOps. But before that, I just want to make sure that we do service endpoints out here to understand what really service endpoints are, because this is a concept that got missed earlier. So just want to do this session out there before we move into something like Azure DevOps as such out there. And one quick thing is that please go through the interview questions once again. And if I just go ahead and give the link here, let me do that. And let me go ahead into the internet, sorry, into the interview questions out here, and let's see. And here I have given, let's say the questions that I've given VPNs, I've given all these things out. I've also given in the same way. I've also given what is service endpoints. So if you just go ahead and look into that, I've given what is service endpoints, why are they used, how are they used for connectivity purposes, and so on and so forth. So please have a look at this and let me know if there are any questions out here as such. Okay, anyone, any questions? Any more questions that I can take with this particular concept? Anyone, any questions, guys? Guys, I need some inputs here. Any questions with service endpoints or any questions in general that you'll have?
Sir, for the single subscription, we have 5,250 DNS endpoints, right?
For a single subscription, when you said DNS endpoints, what exactly do you mean? Can you please elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Sir, we store the like every object we store in the Azure storage that will have a URL address, right? So that
Every,
will be
yes,
having
okay.
the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that we have two endpoints like standard and Azure DNS endpoints. So that was I was
Not
referring.
really. Not really. It's not a standard and Azure DNS endpoints. No. These are just DNS names that Azure exposes whenever you go ahead and let's say store a blob or store, let's say, an object inside that particular service out here. So it's just not really a DNS endpoint. I mean, it's not really a static number. It just depends upon what or which particular blob object that you're really storing out here as such.
Okay, okay, okay.
Okay. Is any more questions, guys? And the reason that I took this class and I did not go into Azure DevOps today is because I wanted to make sure that before we go ahead into Azure DevOps and start, let's say, working on Azure DevOps, I want to make sure that we are clear on this particular concept. And in the coming sessions, we will start with, let's say, the build and release pipelines in Azure DevOps out here as such. So in this week, we will be doing what is a build pipeline, what is a release pipeline, and so on and so forth out here as such. Is any questions, guys? Anyone, any questions that I can take? How comfortable are we with Azure DevOps, guys? Anyone, any questions there? Until today, any questions that I can take till here?
No, sir.
Okay, so that's it from my end today then. Good, please. Sorry. Good.
Can you give a brief explanation about the alerts?
I'm sorry. Can you come again, please? Brief explanation about what?
Alerts.
Alerts, and all these things is something that we will do once we talk about something called application insights. Did we talk about application insights, guys? Did we do that?
Yes, sir.
Yes. And did we do alerts as a part of the application insights? If I remember right, I think we have done that. Okay, we haven't. Okay. So let me do that. Let me take a session on alerts. So I'll give a complete session on alerts on what is alerts and how do you configure the same thing out here as such. Yes, any more questions, guys?
So when you send a pull request, the reviewers has to approve the request, right? So
Correct.
who reviews the request? Is it a DevOps engineer or a developer?
No, it's a developer. If it's a code, it's a developer who reviews the pull request out there. Because as a DevOps engineer, you are not really expected to, let's say, have an understanding of the code. And the reason being, we get a technical lead from the development team and they go ahead and approve the same thing out here as such.
So what exactly is the job I have to do as a DevOps engineer?
Sorry, what exactly?
The job I have to do as a DevOps engineer.
What exactly the job that we have to do? This is the roles and responsibilities. This is the job that we have to do as a DevOps engineer out here as such. So not only going ahead and creating something like CI/CD pipelines, we also go ahead and create repositories, branches, protect the branches of the repository. We have to create CI/CD pipelines. We also have to maintain things on the Azure portal. Like for example, we have to create and maintain ARM templates. We have to create and maintain PowerShell scripts. We have to maintain infrastructure. We have to create alerts and so on and so forth. So we do help the operations team. We do help a couple of people out here. I mean, a couple of teams out here, like the development QAs and etc. Onboard them onto the Azure portal and make sure that everything, or make sure that the entire CI/CD flow is actually running smooth. So if you are asked for the roles and responsibilities, you can refer to this particular document, and that will give you an idea on what are the roles and responsibilities that you perform on a daily basis as a DevOps engineer out here as such.
Sir, in the documentation, the commits that we have made in the feature branches that are merged directly into the main branch. We have
Mm-hmm.
not we merged in the develop branch, right?
We merged in the developer branch again. See, in the documentation, it's just giving you an example. I'm just giving you an example. It can be a main branch, it can be a developer branch, it can be any other branch that your organization is really talking about. It can be anything, but I'm just giving you a sample of how a workflow really goes out. So you can directly, some organizations they directly use the main branch, some organizations they do develop branch, some don't do anything, they directly go with the feature deployments. So it just depends upon what kind of project that you're working. And in this case, I'm just giving you an example of how an organization is really working to have a, let's say, end-to-end CI/CD workflow out here as such.
And when I searched in the internet, I found some different branching strategies out there, like Git flow method, Git lab. So, from
I'm sorry, can you come again, please?
so when I searched in the internet, I found some
Mm-hmm.
different branching strategies out there, like Git method, Git flow method, and trunk based
Mm-hmm.
method.
Okay.
And
Uh, Not really. Again, if you just follow one particular pattern, if you're just aware of one particular pattern, that's good enough. So we do not really need to, let's say, look at the different strategies out there. But if you just are able to follow one simple strategy, that should be good enough out here as such.
I think we are following the Git flow method.
That's correct.
In the trunk-based method, we directly make changes or commit the changes directly into the main branch.
Correct. Okay. So before we come to tomorrow's session again, guys, please make sure to review today's class on what do you mean by a service endpoint. And before you come to the class tomorrow, please revise what is the branching and merging strategy that we were talking about in the earlier class. And also, please make sure to create the repository, see what is a merge conflict and etc. And from tomorrow, we will be starting something called as a build pipeline. We'll be seeing what a build pipeline really is and how's the workflow or how is the workflow on a build pipeline out here as such. So this is what we'll be doing. In today's session, I want to make sure that this topic is covered. So I will introduce multiple topics in between as and when it is required. So the reason that I put this topic in is because in Azure DevOps, we are going to do a lot of deployments and we need to understand what really service endpoints are in order to move forward. So since I missed it earlier, I want to make sure to cover it today. And from tomorrow, we'll continue with our class flow for Azure DevOps out here. Okay, so that's it from my end, guys, today. Thank you and have a good day ahead. And we'll meet tomorrow and we'll discuss on this. Thank you.